Hello, this is Adam Carroll from Justice for All, and I wanted to welcome you to UN this week. This is our November 5th show, and I'll start with a poem. Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. So happy Guy Fawkes Day for all of those who remember the occasion of the plot centered around a group of Roman Catholic revolutionaries furious at the persecution of their faith in England. Today's show also relates to the peaceful and not peaceful transition of power. While we might make reference here to the dramatic US elections this week, with results currently contested, we will put a link in our chat about this. In fact, we should say that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has contested some of Trump's comments and have stated that they harm public trust in democratic institutions. But instead, we'll move our focus to another country in this show, perhaps to compare its post-election tensions to ours and gain some perspective. The country, Cote d'Ivoire. And I wanted to put on the screen an image of Cote d'Ivoire, which viewers may know is adjoining Ghana and Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Liberia. And to discuss the current crisis in the country, in Cote d'Ivoire, we have with us today Christine Caldera, research analyst at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect and Coordination for the NGO Working Group on the Security Council of the UN. She conducts research and advocacy for populations at risk of mass atrocities, focusing on Central African Republic, Central Sahel, and Cote d'Ivoire. So welcome to the show, Christine.
Thank you, Adam. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And I wondered if you might just want to say a couple of words about the center where you work.
Yeah, certainly. So the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect focuses on operationalizing and implementing the responsibility to protect, which is a global norm or a political commitment that was unanimously adopted by heads of states and governments in 2005 at the UN World Summit. I can speak more on what R2P is, which is what it's more commonly known as. But the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect works closely with governments, regional bodies, and national governments that are working on the responsibility to protect. And through our research and advocacy work, we use an atrocity prevention lens to current crisis situations. So this aids us in our analysis on countries such as Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, DRC, the Sahel, and many others, and then also monitoring human rights violations that could potentially escalate to a mass atrocity situation.
So I saw that the center has issued an atrocity alert for two countries this week, Burma or Myanmar, and also for Cote d'Ivoire. Of course, both have something to do with elections. And in Myanmar, as many viewers know, certain ethnic groups such as the Rohingya have been disenfranchised, so that the upcoming election is not going to be free and fair. In Cote d'Ivoire, however, an election took place, and now at least 3,000 people have fled the country, fled violence after the election, and observers are afraid of a repeat of 2010, 2011, when 300,000 fled. And so I was wondering if you could just give us a picture of what's going on now and maybe some of the roots of the crisis?
Yeah, definitely. So kind of where we're at right now stems from the developments over the past few months. So if you kind of scale it back and look at what was going on in the spring. So President Ouattara had announced in March that he would not seek a third term. And this was a very welcome development by many people, since they were fearing that he may indeed seek a third term. The ruling party did find their preferred candidate, who was the prime minister, and he had an untimely death in July, which really did escalate political tensions and kind of called into question who will then be the ruling party's candidate. The vice president also resigned just a week after the death of their preferred candidate, Prime Minister Koulibaly, and that led to then Ouattara's announcement in August that he would seek a third term. And now this was quite a controversial announcement, given that the Constitution of Cote d'Ivoire says presidents are only allowed to have 2 terms. And so the ruling party's logic behind this and saying that it was legal is that the reforms that happened to the Constitution in 2016 reset the clock. And so the 2 terms that President Ouattara had served before would actually just go down to 0. And so he could then run in this election.
He could keep resetting the clock with a new constitution every few years.
Yeah.
That's. I hope that President Trump doesn't hear about that.
Yeah. And so after this announcement, before the Constitutional Council even determined which candidates would be on the ballot, this led to clashes and political protests. And then a rise also in hate speech just in August. And so these political clashes escalated, and about 15 people died just in August alone, where rival political supporters were clashing. And oftentimes this has an ethnic dimension, since many of the candidates actually represent regions or ethnic groups rather than a political ideology. And so that's what many of us fear, is that the violence could escalate along ethnic lines, which we did see in August. And then there was also a worrying trend of unofficial law enforcement, if you want to call them. They were unidentified individuals who were armed and dispersing protesters. So they were working with the security forces and dispersing peaceful protesters with machetes. They were threatening them and attacking them. So this was just a few months before the election. So many were worried that the situation would continue to escalate. And as we saw, it did. In September, the Constitutional Council announced the candidates who would be on the ballot for the October 31st election. And 44 people had applied to be, or had been at least nominated or applied themselves to be candidates. And the Constitutional Council, which is the highest court in Cote d'Ivoire, said only 4 of these 40 people could run and be put on the ballots. There were 2 individuals who were particularly controversial that they were not included, and they had popular support. That includes the former President Gbagbo and the former rebel leader and former ally of President Ouattara and Prime Minister Guillaume Soro. And both are out of Cote d'Ivoire right now, but still have some influence on the country. So many were very disappointed with the Constitutional Council's announcement. And it meant that only former President BDA could run. Pascal Affi Guesson, who was a former prime minister, and then President Ouattara, as I mentioned, and then one individual, Bertine, who's running as the independent candidate and had kind of painted himself as the youth candidate, because many of the youth in Cote d'Ivoire really had high hopes for this election. They are the majority of the population, and really wanted kind of a fresh face. And what we saw in this election was it was really just kind of entrenched political figures who have been around for decades in Cote d'Ivoire politics, fighting it out again in this election. So after September, more violence kind of ensued during October. Part of that is because of these more authoritarian tactics that the government was using. So they had banned political protests through the election campaign period. They also were arbitrarily arresting journalists and peaceful protesters. And the security forces were responding with kind of a disproportionate hand at times as well. So that kind of led to the UN Human Rights Office to issue a statement saying that they were, saw this worrying trend of discriminatory tactics against, these rival political parties to the ruling party, that the security forces were threatening them and trying to stifle dissent. And so these are just the weeks leading up to the election, which was a really tense period. And many had feared even before these developments that there would be some, at least, violence on small scale, because Cote d'Ivoire does have a history of electoral violence. And so leading up to the vote this past Saturday, at least 30 people have been killed in intercommunal clashes or fighting between protesters and the security forces. So we could already see that the situation was escalating there. And so now what we have after the vote, well, I guess I should even say on the day of the vote, 9 people were killed throughout the country, mainly in opposition strongholds. And there were also calls by the 2 main opposition candidates, BDA and Gason, to mobilize their supporters. They said, prevent the election from happening by all legal means, and called for civil disobedience campaign. So that just also incited this other side to not want the election to go forward. So we saw that 23% of polling centers were not able to open due to, this instability. So roads were barricaded, election officials were threatened, even voting materials were destroyed. So it truly wasn't really a competitive election. And then in the days after the election, the 2 main opposition candidates had said, President Ouattara's mandate is over. We no longer recognize him as president, and that they decided to establish what they call a National Transitional Council. What we kind of know now is that they want this body to create new elections that would be inclusive, free, and transparent, is in their words, and set up a government. Then the following day, the Independent Electoral Commission, announced the results, saying that Ouattara won with 94% of the vote. So overwhelmingly victory for him.
Yeah, that seems unlikely, that number.
Well, and they were also reporting that there was a 54% turnout, which compared to the previous election that Ouattara won in 2015 is quite low, but also we did have this active boycott. So we haven't seen a lot of the numbers yet from the international election observer missions, but that's just a domestic observer mission that we've seen so far put out a statement and some numbers and kind of the conditions that they'd seen on Saturday. So we're in this kind of political stalemate now, where Ouattara has won, but the official results have to be formalized by this constitutional council now. So the Electoral Commission has, said their results, and then the Constitutional Council has 7 days to verify it. Now, there's very little chance that they're going to reverse any of these results. I mean, the early numbers show that the other 3 candidates who were running only received 1 to 2% of votes. So they received very little support, but also because their supporters were boycotting. So that's kind of the current political situation that we're in now. And the situation will definitely continue to develop. And
not a lot of legitimacy for the president in his 3rd term. But at the same time, he's ensured that there seems no clear alternative. So this commission that's been charged to come up with some sort of plan. What is his relationship with the commission?
The president's relationship?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that has actually been one of the main grievances of the opposition candidates, is that um, even in the year leading up to this election, that the judiciary has become highly politicized, and that especially over different issues, that Ouattara does have, a reach in the courts. And they were also criticizing the Independent Electoral Commission, saying that it's not independent. Back in September, they did try and invite some opposition figures to be a part of the commission, but out of principle, they decided not to join. So the Constitutional Council will likely rule in Ouattara's favor based on what the Independent Commission has said. And what we have just seen in the past with the judiciary is that they have made some highly kind of controversial or political decisions related to the elections. So one of the individuals I had mentioned before, Soro, who was a former ally of Ouattara, was intending to run, and he was quite popular. However, he when he announced his intention to run back in the winter, the court decided actually to try him in absentia for a variety of kind of financial crimes. And so this is not the first time this has happened, because former President Gbagbo was also tried in absentia for embezzlement during 2010. And so the court then said, when they made the final ballot, was that if you were supposedly had a criminal, I'm blanking on the word, but that if you had any sort of criminal history, that then you cannot run. And so this essentially barred Soro from running. And that also,
yeah, I mean, this is a huge mess, and I see that from these dirty tricks and these legal maneuvers to the politicization of the courts, that yes, it does resemble the current U.S. Election, though perhaps in a more extreme form. But it really does have, and this unfortunately seems to be the global trend, to undermine democracy, which must mean that democracy matters if there's all this effort to undermine it and destroy. But I was wondering, behind all these maneuvers, and of course, whoever gets the power will benefit financially, I'm sure. But are there, as far as the ethnic groups that are engaged and the cultural aspects, I think most viewers, and also I, don't know much about the country. Its legacy of colonialism, perhaps. What kind of earlier root causes are there for this kind of destabilized situation?
No, that's a great question. And part of the reason why we are where we are today with the situation in Cote d'Ivoire is because these kind of longstanding socio-political grievances have not been properly addressed. And like I mentioned before, Cote d'Ivoire has a history of electoral violence because elections have triggered identity-based conflicts and atrocities before. So overall, Cote d'Ivoire is fairly diverse. There are 60 different ethnic groups. But what's interesting, and kind of what I said before, is that people do vote more so for the candidate who represents their region or ethnic group rather than political ideology. And so what we see here is that the South is more of the Muslim region, and then the North is the Christian region, in a very simple sense, of course. And Ouattara gains a lot of his support from the North.
So is it primarily the Muslims who are fleeing now?
That I have not seen. I know most of the people who have been fleeing are women and children, and also people who were just recently repatriated back to Cote d'Ivoire from the previous violence. So, and they expect more to go to Liberia, Ghana, and Togo in the
Yeah.
coming days.
Maybe we could have the map up again, just to take a look at thank you, where people are fleeing. So, if you could maybe explain like where people may be fleeing from.
Yeah, and I think I may have misstated. So now I don't remember if I said it, but it's actually the Muslim North and the Christian South. I think I reversed that
Okay.
because Ouattara gets most of his support from the North.
Okay.
So yes, people are fleeing to the neighboring countries. Mainly Liberia is what we see right now. In Liberia, the government did release a statement saying that, we're welcoming them. We really want to help them since they helped us during our kind of political crisis. And so at least there is no kind of backlash that we've seen yet with the influx of refugees. But I'll answer your initial question as well of kind of what the root causes of this are. So Cote d'Ivoire has had 2 civil wars in the past couple of decades. So the first kind of violence, I should say even the first election-related violence was in 2000. And so that led to violence that really no one has really been held accountable for. And it led to the election of Gbagbo, which then we saw the civil war happen in 2000, starting in 2002, and that kind of split the country into 2. So there was this Muslim-held North region, and then the Christian-held South. And so this civil war ended around 2007, but a lot of the ethnic and religious kind of grievances and divisions that caused this civil war have remained. And then we saw these kind of emerge again in November 2010, which was the presidential elections between Gbagbo and Ouattara. And both groups targeted perceived ethnic and political enemies. And, this led to approximately 3,000 people being killed. And as you said, more than 300,000 were forced to flee, and then 1 million were displaced in the country. So this is really not that long ago, and many kind of were hoping these elections would kind of consolidate democracy and be a step forward in healing. But that does not seem to be the case, at least. After the electoral crisis in 2010, 2011, the country did have transitional justice mechanisms and initiatives to try and, heal the country a bit. This led to prosecutions. It led to a truth commission. However, those also, did not adequately address these grievances. And a lot of the human rights prosecutions that we saw targeted Gbagbo's side rather than Ouattara's side. So a lot of people perceived this as victor's justice, which, these grievances are still present today. And then the other side kind of saw it as, Gbagbo was tried at the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and war crimes for his role in the 2010-2011 crisis. He was acquitted last year, but now there is an appeal process ongoing. So he's remaining in Belgium for that. But the other side then saw it as, well, Gbagbo, is undergoing this, and his side is going through an international court. But no one really on Ouattara's side has, brought to that level of justice yet for the atrocities that the other side committed. So this is why we kind of see this winner-take-all sort of situation. And then also, as you mentioned, there is the economic side of things. So under Ouattara, Cote d'Ivoire's economy has flourished. He's really welcomed international support in that way. They've invested in agriculture and infrastructure projects, which is, great for the country. However, they do have a very high unemployment rate, and that many see that these economic opportunities and economic benefits have truly only benefited Ouattara's allies, or at least his ethnic group. And that, this has led to further grievances of that, some people feel that, we want Ouattara to be in still, even if it's an unconstitutional third term, because he did have lots of benefits for the people. Whereas then others are saying these inequalities, have given certain groups of Ivorians the unfair advantage. And many fear with this recent political instability that the economy will feel it. And we already have seen that some of the cocoa production has already stopped. So some farmers are actually afraid to go out to their fields due to the fear of violence. And then
there's COVID-19, I'm sure, which is it must be a factor in all of this as well.
Yes, well, and that has also halted the economy a bit. And then the other thing to mention is the impunity. So, like I was saying, with the accountability aspect, that there are some former perpetrators of atrocities who are remaining in the military or positions of power, which is also kind of a worrying aspect.
I'm sorry to hear that the Truth Commission is not seen as fair, because I have heard it referred to at the UN as a success story. But it may all be relative.
And I would just say it was more so the prosecutions, so the human rights prosecutions, that more feel are unfair than the Truth Commission. I think most of the criticism with this Truth Commission is that it was delayed. It took too long to, be released, and it wasn't just accessible to everyone as they should be.
So there are a lot of resentments and fault lines in society. And if one was to assume that this president does serve a third term, he, to put it politely to him, faces a huge challenge to unite the country. And if in the past he has not been a uniter, then I wonder what the international community could do, whether it's bilateral alliances or multilateral forms of pressure, whether it's trading partners, whether it's regional blocs of some sort, the African Union. Do you see any possibility of constructive action?
I do. And even before the elections took place, many in the international community were kind of issuing warning statements. So, for example, the UN Human Rights Office back in September had noted the pre-existing risk factors that I mentioned, in addition to the rise in hate speech that was, using manipulating ethnic differences to incite violence. They noted all of these trends and said they were concerned in watching. And then in October, I think it was about a week or two before the elections actually were held, they did also call for accountability based upon, at that time, we had said about 20 people were killed in clashes. And so the UN Human Rights Office was calling for, impartial and thorough investigations, and also calling for authorities to refrain from using hate speech and inflammatory rhetoric to incite violence based on ethnic identities or political affiliation. The International Criminal Court had also issued a statement. The chief prosecutor had said that, warning that the violence must not escalate to the levels that it had in the pre and post 2011-2010 crisis. They had also mentioned that any crimes that are committed that fall under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court or are crimes defined in the Rome Statute would be investigated. So that is a quite strong statement. And then we also had Western governments such as France had met with Ouattara, kind of wanting at least to engage in dialogue beforehand. The US had also issued statements, and then after the elections, there have been several from the EU, the US, and France. Most of them are very similar, calling for dialogue, as well as investigations into these alleged human rights violations and abuses by security forces, particularly, with these unidentified individuals. And the UN Secretary General has also issued statements, as well as the AU and ECOWAS.
Oh, that's pretty good action. It's heartening. I hope it works. In the Security Council itself, are any countries standing in the way of action?
So we have not seen anything on the Security Council's agenda yet with Cote d'Ivoire. So it'll be interesting to see if the situation continues to escalate, if they will hold an emergency meeting or under any other business possibly. But I know some actors are hoping for that for sure. But that's it's not necessary for the Security Council to get involved for the situation to hopefully become under control. Like you mentioned, ECOWAS and the EU have a big role in the region and are already active there. They were active there before the election with a mission that was sent there, and also their observer mission. So,
well, that's good. So we're going to take a really short break to give some promotion, and so we will be right back. This is Adam Carroll with UN This Week. And we are back. This is UN This Week. I'm speaking with Christine Caldera from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. We're speaking about the current crisis in post-election crisis in, not US, in Cote d'Ivoire. And it's quite serious. We've been talking about what some of the UN entities and agencies have been doing. I did want to ask about a hearing that took place in Congress last week. It was entitled Atrocity Prevention and Early Warning, the U.S. Government Framework and Cote d'Ivoire. So a very timely subject. I was wondering if you attended and what you thought of the hearing.
So I could not attend the actual hearing, but I did attend a side event that was held by the Tom Lantos Commission. And so essentially what this resolution is about, it's from the Representative Dean Phillips from Minnesota. He had issued a resolution or introduced a resolution in early October in support of peaceful elections for Cote d'Ivoire. And so he, this statement really wanted free and fair elections that, the House Foreign Affairs Committee would approve. And it had bipartisan support, which is great, and not surprising really with Cote d'Ivoire. And so he wanted to call attention to the situation and urge early action, to prevent the situation from escalating. And they also wanted to ensure that the elections were legitimate and transparent. And so at least the meeting I had attended they were kind of stressing that it's really important to have these sorts of early warning systems in place, and that Congress is able to do so by paying attention to these sorts of monitoring reports. And, part of that is like what our aim is with atrocity alerts is to call attention to a potentially escalating situation. And so through this resolution, that is what Phillips was trying to do, and just to kind of raise support and raise awareness of, because at that point people had already been killed in pre-electoral clashes. So
it wasn't about passing a bill with all congressional representatives signing. It was more about sending a message, basically.
Yeah. So the legislation will continue through the House.
Okay.
But I'm not entirely sure where that is at this point right now.
Right.
And after the vote, the U.S. Embassy did release a statement, kind of calling for calm after the situation and to respect the rule of law and restore constitutional order, which at least I saw on Twitter had caused some of us stir just because of what is going on in our own country with our elections, and then the U.S. government, issuing that statement on Cote d'Ivoire. So just kind of an interesting connection between the two.
Right. Who are they to tell us? Right. I can imagine. But anyway, Congress certainly has a lot of resolutions that are floating around in committee and in different stages, and sometimes that language finds its way into other bills. So it's certainly a long sausage-making process, but it's good that it's out there, and that this concern has bipartisan involvement. And perhaps if people want to press their elected official, that's something that the viewers could do, is they could find out, does this have a number or a name?
Yeah, I think it's House Resolution 1150.
1150. And just to call the main switchboard of Congress and say, this is where I live, and I'd like to ask my congressman to support Resolution 1150. And so that would be something concrete that viewers could do. I understand that there's USAID development staff and also Department of Defense personnel that have been offering training in countries, including Cote d'Ivoire, to try to prevent atrocities. I don't know how successful, but it's a noble idea. Have you heard anything about those programs?
I'm not too familiar with either of those, actually.
Yeah, it just was mentioned in passing. I think it's a program that is partly a partnership with the Auschwitz Institute. And anyway, it's I hope that we can see atrocities prevented in this situation as well as elsewhere. As far as the U.S. situation, I think that I'll ask our producer to drop into the chat a link to a report from your center on the dangers in the U.S. It's entitled "It Could Happen Here: The U.S. Election and the Threat of Violence," not equating the situation to Cote d'Ivoire directly, but let's look and let's compare and let's learn. So this is I was wondering, as far as other activities of the center, if you want to add anything, both on Cote d'Ivoire and on the region that you work on.
Yeah, so I would just mention that prior to this recent developments, that Cote d'Ivoire really was kind of on the back burner, at least in the countries that I'm monitoring. We, of course, had been monitoring it for some time just because of the risks associated with this election. But at least how it relates to the other countries that I monitor in the Central Sahel, so that would include Mali and Burkina Faso, which are neighboring countries of Cote d'Ivoire, is that many fear that this recent instability could lead to further instability in the Central Sahel, which is already very unstable and, facing a cycle of deadly violence from Islamist armed groups with affiliations with Al-Qaeda, and there's also, violence perpetrated between intercommunal violence and self-defense groups, and then also the security forces. And so the situation is highly unstable there, and many fear that this could spread if Cote d'Ivoire, who, for a while had a strong democracy, will this crisis will further develop. So that is something that's on our radar to watch for, just kind of the undermining of democracy. And this also, relates to the developments in Guinea as well, which is a neighbor of Cote d'Ivoire, which just recently had an election and kind of a post-election crisis of its own, where people died. So this is not, unfortunately, the first kind of election-related violence we've seen, and it's a little worrying as Burkina Faso has elections later this month. Niger has elections in December, and then Central African Republic also has elections in December. So.
Well, that is concerning, and we should continue to monitor that and educate the community about these concerns. Yeah.
And I would just say, at least with the US piece, it was slightly unprecedented. So it's the first time the Global Center had issued an atrocity alert on the US. So that was a couple months ago. We had released one. And then this commentary piece was also kind of unprecedented, but necessary given, the developments we've seen in our country.
Yeah. And that struggle continues. So we will leave it there. But again, this is why human rights matters. We can't take it for granted. We can't take democracy for granted. All of this peace and security has to be really defended, and not necessarily militarily, but through rule of law and through the work that your center is doing. So it's very much appreciated. So that's it for everyone, and we will be back next week. Thank you so much, Christine, and we'll see you at the next show.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.